Good morning, guys. Mr. Monk here. We didn't get to have a conference this week, so I wanted to come to you guys. I know I'm giving you an assignment to read over section 2 of your chapter on Russia. So what I want to do today in just a quick short video that you could view, that you could watch, get a little information, is to try to make the effect of being in class just a little bit more realistic so I can talk kind of through the section, just kind of like we do in class. Some of the high main points of the section so you can use to review or help you out with your discussion board, things such as that. Okay, so we're just going to go through this really quick. It's not going to be anything long. We're going to talk about some key vocab terms. We're going to talk about some of the history, particularly the emergence of Russia in section 2, and like I said, it won't be long, and then you guys can watch this and then continue on with the next assignment. Alright, so if you start on page 422, of course, section 2 begins with the emergence of Russia, right? So if you look early in the section, what one note you're going to see is that modern Russia, what we consider to be modern Russia, okay? This is separate from what we consider Eastern Slavic civilization that we talk about in world history. But modern Russia began really in the 800s when Slavic peoples living in Eastern Europe confronted the Vikings, who were using the region's rivers in search of trade routes between Scandinavia and the Black Sea. Okay, so essentially what happened is that the area that these Slavic peoples were living in, the Vikings kept using their rivers to trade on, sail up and down, and they finally confronted them. So they're going to fight on between once another for a number of years. And eventually what the Slavs are going to allow the Vikings to do is establish a state in their land. So from the 800s to the 1200s, Russian princes are going to rule a sizable area in and around the current Ukrainian capital of Kiev. Okay. During this time, Russian rulers adopted Orthodox Christianity, and of course the Russian Orthodox Church is going to be a pillar of state power for centuries to come. Okay, so let's look at the section Russia under the Tsars. Alright, that's how you say that, Tsars, not Caesars. Alright, so in the late 1300s, Russian princes in Moscow began 2 centuries of fighting to repel this group of people called the Mongols that they had been having trouble with really ever since the early 1200s. Okay, so once they do defeat the Mongols and expel them out of around Moscow, an area kind of what we see as modern Russia today, Russia's really going to begin near 3 centuries of growth. Okay, so no sizable or powerful groups of people stood up against them, and few natural barriers limited the steady expansion of the nation. And at this point, what we're really going to see is this growth of Russian power, okay, over the coming centuries. And we're going to see changes that occur, okay, and for instance, the power structure with the Tsar kind of originally in charge, and then we're going to see the emergence of a communist government, and then today what we consider more of a democratic Russia, okay. But first of all, what we're going to have is we're going to have monarchs, all right, a series of monarchs called the Tsars, okay. And this is a variant of the word Caesar, kind of that you get from ancient Rome, right? We think about Caesar that was in control, okay. But these Tsars are going to oversee the expansion of Russia, all right. So Peter the Great, we're going to talk about just a few that were kind of mainstream, really important in Russia's history. So Peter the Great, who's going to govern the late 1600s, early 1700s, is going to expand control to the Pacific Ocean in the east and to the Baltic in the west, where he's going to build a new capital city at St. Petersburg. All right, later in the 1700s, Catherine the Great, who's another great, Russian ruler, is going to expand Russian control farther to the west and going to gain control of parts of Poland, Belarus, and Ukraine. Okay, 1812 is when we're really going to see this first challenge to Russian power with the invasion of Napoleon and his French forces. So Napoleon's going to lead about 600,000 troops into Russia. So just imagine the magnitude of the number of troops that includes to invade this country. Late in the year, Napoleon, of course, is going to capture Moscow. And as they fled the city, though, what the residents and the fleeing troops of the Russian army are going to do as the French are coming in is that they are going to essentially burn Moscow to the ground and all the supplies, all the food, as much as they can burn up with it. All right. And what this is going to do is this is going to take away some of these very, very heavily needed supplies that the French soldiers are going to need in the coming months, especially in the rough, wild Russian wilderness in the middle of winter. So essentially what's going to happen over the next few months is Russia's geography is going to become its most important defender. And of course the bitterly cold weather and vast distances separating the French troops and their supply lines is going to force Napoleon to make a long, harrowing retreat. Okay, and get this. So of the 100,000 who left Moscow, with him after they captured Moscow, fewer than 30,000 are going to return to France. So 7 out of 10. All right, that's crazy. All right. So let's switch over to social structure. Let's talk about that just a little bit. All right, so despite the enormous size of the empire during that time period, Russia is going to remain more backward, in terms of advancing in technology and the educational sphere, all those kind of things. Particularly, they're going to be very backward compared to a lot of the other Western nations. Remnants of feudalism are going to remain throughout the 1800s. Of course, you may have talked about feudalism before, right? This relationship between like lords and then in the monarchs, right? And this exchange relationship of power and land with protection for the king or for the czar. So what that's going to do for peasants, many peasants, right, are going to be forced to work on the land of wealthy property owners through the system of serfdom, is another word you've probably heard before. And essentially what the peasants are going to be are slaves, So serfdom in Russia is eventually going to be abolished in 1861, right, just 4 years before slavery is going to be outlawed in the United States. However, like in the United States, what we're going to see, even though serfdom is abolished, a lot of these people, right, they're like, we're free. But there's essentially nowhere for them to go because all the wealthy landowners still own the majority of the land, right? And these people don't have education. They don't have resources to go and start a small business. They don't have what they need to do. So what does it end up forcing them to do? They go straight back working for their same slave owners, or serf owners before, working for very poor wages, just completely disadvantaged in so many ways. And it really is a great comparison to what happens in the United States following the abolishment of slavery. All right, and this is going to leave lots of people poor and dissatisfied, right? And really, it's going to make them feel like maybe they were better off when they weren't free, But some of this frustration is going to lead to the rise of communism in the Soviet Union, And what we see, kind of particularly what happens in the United States, and kind of just how history divulges in the Soviet Union, right? All these serfs and peasants is going to lead to this uprising in communist thinking, particularly in not a market economy, in command economies, and with the ideas of Karl Marx, the German economist. But in the United States, right, we're even going to see late 19th century, early 20th century socialist and communist ideas kind of coming to the forefront of American thought and American politics. And it's really going to be just certain events that are really going to divulge those movements and keep them from really taking root in the United States. But in the Soviet Union, what we refer to as Russia, Soviet Union, it is going to take root. So let's talk about that, the rise of communism. And now we're on page 423 if you're still following along. So, right, dissatisfaction with the czarist governments is going to increase, right, under the system of serfdom. Not serfdom, following the system of serfdom. So a series of Russian defeats in World War I, right, is going to lead kind of severe food shortages. They're going to lead to riots in St. Petersburg in February of 1917, and this is going to be where Humpty Dumpty falls apart. Right, so when government troops are going to join the rioters, the Tsar is essentially going to give up his throne or his crown. And in 1917, what we're going to have, right, is the Russian Revolution that you may have heard of before. So essentially what the Russian Revolution is going to do is going to establish a new type of government that was based on the ideas of Karl Marx, right, the German economist. So Marx and his followers believed that to achieve social equity, or equality, okay, land and businesses should be owned by people in common, hence the word, right, what we get from that, communism. When the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was established, it comprised Russia and the homelands of the largest ethnic groups. Each republic had its own Soviet, or governing council, and the Supreme Soviet in Moscow made national laws. So in 1940, the Soviet Union forcibly annexed the Baltic nations of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. So essentially what you're going to happen is you're going to have this new form of government, this communist form of government develop. Now what you're going to see is throughout these different territories and nations is kind of the establishment of a state, what we see as a state in the United States with this Soviet or governing council in each state, and of course they're all going to answer to the Supreme Soviet in Moscow, but there is going to be greater amounts of government control, government hand in the economy and in government in controlling, right, very specific things we'll talk about in just a second. So let's talk about the Soviet system. So leaders such as V.I. Lenin and Joseph Stalin, these are probably a couple guys you've heard of before, right, very, very stereotypical communist dictators that we think of today. They're going to establish, of course, a communist dictatorship. The Soviet Union had a command economy. This is an important term you need to make sure you know in your book. One in which a central authority decides what goods will be produced. So officials in Moscow set production goals for the managers of state-run farms, mines, and factories. So essentially under a communist system, what you're going to have is almost essentially all government ownership of private business. Okay? So, for instance, state-run farms, mines, and factories. So instead of Mr. Jones down the street, right, who owns the mine 10 miles down south, the government owns it, okay? And what they do is they hire people to work the mine, and they pay them a wage, instead of someone owning it as a business, right, hiring out people and then keeping the profit for themselves. Under a communist form of government, under a command economy, that's not really fair, right? So essentially, millions of Russians are going to believe, okay, that communism would in fact improve their lives because, right, they wouldn't be subject to these wealthy landowners, these wealthy business owners that would take advantage of them and leave them essentially, right, begging for crumbs, that the government would guarantee them, okay, across the board certain things. But what they're going to find instead is that communism, okay, or communists are going to become their new masters, right? The standard of living is going to remain poor despite promises of these communist dictators. And people had no freedom to make personal decisions or express their opinions, okay? So under communism, what you have is that this promise of government, right, taking care of your needs, promising that everyone will get what they need, but as it played out in the Soviet Union, what you have is that government doesn't do that. People remain poor. And then on top of that, their rights and freedoms are taken away. And they don't have the opportunity to voice their frustrations to their government. Okay? So those that do resist, those that do try to voice their opinions, millions are going to be sent to prisons or forced labor camps in Siberia or elsewhere, right? Talking about getting banished to the ends of the earth, right? That's what we get that idea from. So vast numbers were even executed, okay? So let's go over and let's talk about agriculture and industry under the communist system. So under Soviet rule, farmland was reorganized into state farms and collective farms. So you didn't have individual farms that were owned by, right, Mr. John, Mr. Joe, or whoever, right? The government owned the farms. And what they would do is they would collect different farms and put them together and form a collective farm. So farmers were forced to work on them, okay? So state farm workers, like factory workers, received wages, okay? On collectives, workers shared any surpluses that remained after products were sold and costs were paid. So essentially what the government wanted to do is make sure that what you spend, right, that you paid for that, okay, on this collective farm, that what the government spent on the farm for, right, for seed, for planting, for wages, all this stuff, that they would come out even with the products or the profits, okay? If there was any money left over, the workers could split that, but oftentimes it didn't happen that way. It just went into the government's treasury, okay? But, right, few incentives existed under this system for farmers really to work hard or work extra hard every day because, right, if they worked extra hard, it didn't really bring about any benefit to them, okay? So Soviet agricultural production and distribution is going to remain fairly low throughout this time period, despite strict central control, meaning Soviet farmers were permitted to cultivate gardens on small plots of land. And this is going to be the savior for some small farmers. It's going to get them over the hump year after year. All right, so let's talk about international conflicts. We're going to talk some about World War II and then the Cold War. So, in June 1941, German troops, of course, were going to attack the Soviet Union. In just 6 months, German forces are going to be on the outskirts of Moscow and Leningrad, right? Which Leningrad was the new name for St. Petersburg. Soviet troops and people are going to fight back fiercely, and like the French a century earlier, right, German troops are going to learn how hard it is to live off the countryside, okay? And given the length between their supply lines and troop lines, okay, German forces are going to slowly be swept from the Soviet land in the next 3 or 4 years. In May of 1945, Soviet troops are going to control the capital city, right, German capital of Berlin. We even see kind of the race between the United States and the Soviet Union in trying to get there, right, first. So the victory, though, for the Soviet Union is going to come at great cost in World War II, right? So more than 20 million Soviet troops and civilians are going to die in World War II, okay, 20 million. All right, so let's talk some about the Cold War. So after World War II, right, the two nations that are going to kind of emerge as the world powers, or the power players is going to be the United States and the Soviet Union, right? And they're going to be vying for power all throughout the world, trying to establish. And what you kind of have this clash, right, between this Western democratic government or style of government with the market economy or free market economy, and then what you have in the East is, right, the Soviet Union with their communist form of government and their command economy. So really two opposites clashing together, kind of vying for power throughout the world. So you can imagine why it got pretty heated over the next 10 to 15, 20 years. All right, so nuclear weapons, right, advanced tanks, jets, and submarines are going to make the Soviet Union a superpower. From the 1940s until the 1980s, Soviet rulers in Moscow are going to control communist governments. However, in a struggle called the Cold War, the Soviet Union is going to compete with power with the United States, and although the two nations never fought directly, actually, both states are going to spend enormous sums of money on military weapons. And a lot of folks say that this is really the cause for why the Soviet Union is eventually going to fall kind of flat on their face under the communist government is because of the amount of money they spend trying to keep up with the United States. And we do the same thing. Truth is, when you are willing to compete against someone, right, and you're spending money, you got to have the money to back it up, or over time you're going to go broke. And this is kind of what happens with the Soviet Union. So let's talk about the end of communist rule. We're almost done here. I know I've already taken 19 minutes, which is crazy. But it's still pretty short compared to our 50-minute class time. All right. So parades often highlighted Soviet military strength, but the spending on troops and equipment weighed heavily on the economy. Right. So most Soviet citizens thought of the long lines for limited supplies of food and other products. So let's talk about economic reorganization, and this is where we're going to bring into the discussion a man by the name of Mikhail Gorbachev. right? Is if you remember or have any um, thoughts about American history, right? Ronald Reagan, who was president in the 80s, and Gorbachev are going to kind of have this very ironic and different relationship. But really, Gorbachev is going to be this leader that's going to bring about a measure of economic reorganization in the Soviet Union that is, I would argue, that really is going to lead to a more democratic view of the economy and government for the Soviet people. And then, of course, the Russian people. All right, so in the late 1980s, Gorbachev's going to begin those radical reforms to the economy. He's going to institute the policy of glasnost. Okay, that's a term you need to know, which is openness, right? Which is going to allow citizens and news media to say what they wish without fear of government persecution. This is going to allow people in the media to kind of speak freely, right? Which they hadn't been able to do under the communist form of government. So his idea is that if you allow people in the media some type of freedom, okay, you give them a voice of expression where they can voice their opinions, right? And you kind of relieve some of the stress that people live under the communist government, and perhaps that would even hamper down on some of the trouble that the Russian or the Soviet government had with some of its citizens and their protests. Gorbachev is also going to offer a plan for perestroika, or economic restructuring, which is going to call for a gradual change from a command system to private ownership. So what this is going to do, we've talked about this in class before, is take some of those businesses, some of those large industries that are in the hands of the government and start to restore them to the hands of private individuals. Right? Instead of the government deciding what kind of products would be produced and how much would be produced, this would be left in the hands, right, of factory managers instead of government managers. Right? Farmers were started to be granted long-term leases on land, right? Instead of, right, being forced to produce this or that by the government. All right, so let's talk about political change. So, given new freedoms, many people are going to call for an end to communism, right, and central government domination. Right when the Soviet people get a sense of what life is like beyond communism, for a lot of people, it kind of comes contagious, right? That they want to see what's on the other side of the fence, right? So the Baltic republics are going to declare their independence, and what you're going to see is nations, territories that were previously part of the Soviet Union are going to start to declare their independence in the 1990s. And early in 1991, Russians are going to vote in their first democratic election, selecting Boris Yeltsin as president of the Russian Republic. And at the end of that year, Gorbachev is going to declare and resign, announcing that the end of the Soviet Union had come. Okay, he said, "We live in a new world. Some of the republics are going to join with Russia in a loose association, the Commonwealth of Independent States. But what you're going to see throughout the country is this new level of independence, okay, that hadn't existed before. So planning for the future. With only a brief experience in democracy, Russia faces still many challenges today, right? Of course, kind of still changing their economy from command to market. Some government structure stuff that still exists that kind of makes it difficult for things. And of course, you also have the emergence of Vladimir Putin, which challenged things a little bit, right? Yeltsin is going to resign in 1999, and in 2000, Putin actually becomes acting president. And his administration kind of was bolstered right at the beginning with this economic boom that's going to follow him becoming president. But if you think about what year it is, 2020, so Putin's been in power 20 years from now, and he's kind of connived and gotten his way around remaining the president of Russia. Maybe not always an official term, But there are some concerns what Putin's intention might be, and there's really still concerns today about who Russia really is as a nation. Are they, in fact, a democratic style government, or are they starting to revert back to a communist style government under Putin? That's really left up for people to just research and believe on their own. But I hope you see kind of the gradual change over time from the beginning of the history of Russia all the way to current day, right, where we're talking about Trump and colluding with Russia and this relationship that Russia still has to the world, okay? And particularly its relationship to Eastern nations, right? North Korea and China, or as our president says, China, okay? But that's kind of a general landscape of the emergence of Russia, right, and where we are today. And what we'll talk about at Section 3 is really these geographic issues in Russia that the country has to deal with today. So we'll get a little bit back on the geography. Okay, but for today, that'll end our discussion. Almost 30 minutes, just short of it. So make sure you listen through this. I hope you got all the way to the end. Make sure you guys fill out the discussion post if you haven't already and be looking for more work to come. All right, guys, have a great afternoon. Appreciate your time. Thanks.